The gilded halls of the Buckingham Palace Royal Mews echoed with the soft, authoritative clip of Captain Kofi Mensah's boots. His uniform, the iconic scarlet tunic and bearskin cap, was immaculate, a second skin of discipline and pride. At 6'4", with a posture that seemed to defy gravity itself, he was the very image of a Queen's Guard. As the newly appointed captain of the Queen's Life Guard, a position of immense prestige and responsibility, he was the first to hold the office who looked like him. The weight of that history was a mantle he wore with quiet solemnity. His journey here, from a council estate in Brixton to the heart of the British establishment, had been one of relentless excellence, of being twice as good to be considered half as capable. Today he was running an errand of personal significance. He needed to collect a family heirloom, a pocket watch that had belonged to his Ghanaian grandfather, a man who had served the crown in a different era, from a jeweller in an affluent, predominantly white London borough. He was off duty, dressed in dark jeans and a simple, well-fitted navy jumper. The only hint of his profession was the unshakable bearing he carried, a quiet command in his eyes. The sun was dappling through the plane trees as he parked his modest sedan. The errand was quick, the watch, now polished and repaired, a heavy, comforting weight in his pocket. He was just pulling out into the traffic, his mind already on the afternoon's guard mounting ceremony, when the blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror. Kofi's brows furrowed slightly. He was certain he had signaled. He pulled over smoothly, the familiar routine of the stop settling over him, though from the opposite side he was used to. He rolled down his window, the crisp London air mixing with the sudden tension. The officer who approached had a swagger that was all too familiar, mid-30s, with a tight jaw and a gaze that scanned the car's interior with practiced suspicion. License and registration, the officer said, his voice a flat bureaucratic monotone. His eyes, however, were anything but neutral. They were already cataloguing. The car, a few years old but clean. The driver, a large black man, well-dressed but, in this neighborhood, an anomaly. Kofi complied, his movements deliberate and calm as he retrieved the documents from the glove compartment. Of course, officer. Do you know why I stopped you? The officer asked, leaning closer, his elbows resting on the doorframe. The name on his badge read, P.C. Davis. I'm not certain, officer, Kofi replied, his voice a deep, measured baritone. I believed I signaled my turn. You drifted over the white line back there, Davis said, though the assertion lacked conviction. His attention was elsewhere, on Kofi himself. This your car? Yes, it is. The registration and my address are there. Kofi gestured to the documents in Davis's hand. Davis didn't look at them. His gaze was, fixed on Kofi, a subtle shift in his posture signaling an escalation. You're a long way from home, aren't you? What brings you to this part of town? Kofi felt the first prickle of irritation. A cold spark he immediately banked. I had some business to attend to. Business? Davis repeated, the word laced with doubt. What kind of business? Personal business, Kofi said, his tone remaining even, but a steel core beginning to form within it. He could feel the narrative being constructed around him, a story he had spent his entire life deconstructing with his every action. Davis's lips twitched. The calm, unflinching demeanor seemed to irk him. Step out of the car for me, sir. Kofi's grip on the steering wheel tightened for a fraction of a second. Is there a problem, officer? I said, step out of the car, Davis repeated, his voice hardening. You don't want to make this difficult. The unspoken threat hung in the air between them. Kofi exhaled slowly, a controlled release of breath, and opened the door. As he unfolded his large frame from the vehicle, he seemed to tower over Davis. The officer took an instinctive half-step back, his hand drifting towards his belt. Hands where I can see them, Davis instructed, his confidence slightly rattled by Kofi's sheer presence. Kofi complied, placing his hands on the roof of the car. The cold metal seeped through his jumper. Is this really necessary? I was simply running an errand. We've had reports of break-ins in the area, Davis said, his eyes scanning Kofi up and down. You fit a description. Kofi turned his head, his gaze locking with Davis's. A description of a man in a navy jumper and dark jeans? Or does the description have more to do with the color of my skin? The question landed not as an accusation, but as a simple, devastatingly clear inquiry. Davis's composure faltered. He straightened up, his face flushing. Watch your tone? I'm conducting a routine check, and I am simply seeking clarity on the grounds for this routine search, Kofi replied, his voice still calm, but now carrying the weight of absolute authority. Transparency is the bedrock of public trust, is it not? Davis scoffed, but didn't answer. He began a pat-down, his hands rougher than procedure dictated. A performative display of control. He patted the pockets of Kofi's jeans, his jumper, his movements quick and invasive. His hand brushed against the hard, circular object in Kofi's pocket. What's this? Davis demanded, his voice sharp with triumph. Kofi didn't flinch. My grandfather's pocket watch. You may retrieve it if you wish. Carefully, please. It is an heirloom. Davis pulled out the old, beautifully engraved timepiece. He turned it over in his hands, looking for something. Anything that didn't belong. Finding nothing, his disappointment was palpable. He shoved it back into Kofi's pocket. You seem very comfortable with this, Davis muttered, almost to himself, stepping back. Like you've been through it before. Like you know all the right things to say. Kofi turned to face him fully, his arms now crossed over his broad chest. The posture was not one of aggression, but of immense, unassailable patience. Experienced officer, is not the same as guilt. Sometimes it is merely the result of frequent unwarranted lessons. Davis's eyes narrowed. He was floundering and he knew it. The script was not being followed. This man wasn't scared, wasn't angry in the way he expected. He was disappointed, and that was somehow worse. You a lawyer or something? Kofi allowed a faint, humorless smile to touch his lips. Or something. The ambiguity infuriated Davis. He stepped closer again. The space between them charged. Listen, you think you're clever? You think you can just talk your way out of everything? People like you always. He stopped, but the words hung in the air, toxic and unfinished. Kofi's expression didn't change, but his eyes became twin points of flint. People like me, Officer Davis? He repeated, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more powerful than a shout. Please, finish your sentence. What is it about people like me that you find so threatening? Davis bristled, his jaw working. He had crossed a line, and the ground on the other side was giving way beneath him. You know what I mean, he mumbled, the fight draining from his voice, replaced by a sullen defiance. I think I do, Kofi said, his voice regaining its volume, each word crisp and clear. And I think we have both known, from the moment you saw me, that this was never about a white line on the road. It was about a line you have drawn in your own mind. Davis had no retort. He stood there, exposed, the machinery of his bias laid bare and grinding to a halt. The balance of power had not just shifted, it had inverted. Kofi's voice broke the heavy silence, steady and final. Officer Davies, I think our interaction has reached its conclusion. But before I go, there is something you need to see. With the same deliberate calm he had exhibited throughout, Kofi reached into his back pocket. Davis's hand twitched again, but he was frozen watching. I am reaching for my identification, Kofi announced. He pulled out a slim black leather wallet. He didn't just open it, he presented it, holding it so the badge and the ID card within were perfectly visible to the stunned officer. The card bore his photograph, his name and his title. Clear and unambiguous. Captain Kofi Mensah, Captain of the Queen's Lifeguard, Household Cavalry. Davis's eyes widened, darting from the ID to Kofi's face and back again. His mouth opened, but only a dry, choked sound emerged. The blood drained from his face, leaving a pale, waxy mask of dawning horror. Yes, Kofi said, answering the unspoken question. My job is to protect the crown, to be a symbol of duty, honor, and integrity. Qualities which, it seems, are not as universal in uniform as one would hope. He took a single step forward, and Davis seemed to shrink. Do you know what the greatest failure here is, Officer Davies? Kofi asked, his voice not angry, but profoundly weary. It is not your prejudice, though that is grave. It is your lack of vision. You looked at me and saw only a stereotype. You could not see a man worthy of respect, a man who has sworn an oath to Queen and country, a man who stands guard outside the very heart of this nation. You saw only the color of my skin, and in doing so, you dishonored not me, but the very institution you claimed to serve. He took his wallet back, tucking it away. You will return my documents, you will get into your vehicle, and you will drive away. And you will spend the rest of your career, however long it may last, remembering this moment, remembering the day you assumed you were the authority, and you learned you were, in fact, being judged by a standard you yourself could not meet. Davies, utterly broken, wordlessly handed back the license and registration. His hands were trembling. Kofi took them, slid back into his car and started the engine. He did not look back. In his rearview mirror, he saw PC Davis still standing on the pavement, a solitary, diminished figure in the fading London light. His worldview shattered, his future as a police officer hanging by the thinnest of threads. For Kofi Mensah, the drive back to the barracks was quiet, but his mind was already turning, not with personal vindication, but with a grim sense of purpose. The encounter was a symptom of a sickness, and he was now in a unique position to administer a cure. The palace walls could not, and would not, be a refuge from this fight. They would be the ground upon which it was won. He parked his car, the transition from civilian to captain seamless, as he changed into his full dress uniform. The scarlet tunic felt heavier today, weighted with the burden and the promise of his position. The bearskin cap, when he placed it on his head, was not just a piece of uniform, it was a crown of responsibility. He emerged into the courtyard where his squadron was assembled, a splash of brilliant red against the grey stone. The men stood at attention, their faces a mirror of disciplined neutrality. But Kofi saw more. He saw the young black trooper, fresh-faced and trying hard to conceal his awe. He saw the veteran sergeant, a man who had initially been skeptical of his new captain. He saw a microcosm of the country he served. He took his position at the head of the guard, his voice cutting through the crisp air, commanding and clear. Stand ready! The boots snapped together in perfect unison. As they began the precise, timeless drill of the changing of the guard, Kofi's gaze was fixed ahead, but his resolve was focused inward. This was not the end. It was the beginning. The discrimination had happened on the outside, but the reckoning would begin within the very institutions that were meant to represent the best of Britain, and he, Captain Kofi Mensah, would be the one to lead it. The ceremony was flawless. Every boot struck the gravel in perfect unison. Every musket gleamed in the pallid English sun. As Captain Mensah led the guard through the intricate, centuries-old drill, his face was a mask of stoic discipline. But beneath the bearskin cap, his mind was a whirlwind. The encounter with PC Davis wasn't an isolated incident. It was a data point, a confirmation of a systemic illness he had dedicated his life to overcoming. Now he held a position of influence, a lever he could pull. The question was not if, but how. Later, in his Spartan office within the Horse Guards building, the scent of polish and old wood filled the air. He dismissed his adjutant with a quiet word and sat behind his desk. Before him lay not military reports, but a fresh blank notepad. He picked up a pen, the weight of it familiar in his hand, and began to write. Not a report. A formal complaint would be too narrow, too easily buried. He was drafting a proposal, a memorandum to the highest echelons of the Ministry of Defense and the palace itself, outlining a new mandatory initiative, ethical engagement and unconscious bias. Training for all civil and armed constabularies with royal palace access. His argument was precise, leveraging the language of the institution he served. He wrote of operational security, pointing out that an officer who made flawed, biased judgments off duty was a security risk on duty. He spoke of the sanctity of the crown's image, arguing that the men and women who protected the monarchy must reflect its modern, diverse nation, not only in appearance but in ethos. He cited the Davis incident not as a personal grievance, but as a case study in catastrophic perceptual failure. A failure that, had it been directed at a foreign dignitary, could have caused an international incident. A knock at the door interrupted his flow. Enter. It was Sergeant Major Fletcher, a man with a face like a weathered cliff and a career that spanned 4 decades. "Captain," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "The lads are asking about the summer rotation." He placed a file on the desk, but his eyes, sharp and perceptive, lingered on Kofi's face. "Rough afternoon, sir?" Kofi leaned back, steepling his fingers. Fletcher was old guard, a man of entrenched traditions, but he was also fiercely loyal to the unit itself. He was a gatekeeper Kofi needed on his side. "An instructive one, Sergeant Major," Kofi replied, choosing his words with care. "I was reminded that the respect this uniform commands within these walls is not always accorded to the man wearing it outside of them." Fletcher's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He understood. "I see, sir. I am drafting a proposal to ensure that the standards we uphold here are understood and reflected by all our supporting services," Kofi continued, watching the older man's reaction. "It concerns training, a realignment of perspective." "Training, sir?" Fletcher's tone was neutral, but a flicker of skepticism crossed his features. "With all due respect, you can't train decency into a man." "Perhaps not," Kofi conceded, "but you can train procedure, you can ingrain consequence. You can make it abundantly clear that bigotry is not a minor foible, it is a critical failure in a role where judgment is paramount. I would value your input, Sergeant Major. Your experience in these matters is extensive." It was a master stroke. Kofi wasn't demanding, he was inviting. He was acknowledging Fletcher's authority while asserting his own. The Sergeant Major was silent for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the notepad filled with Kofi's precise script. "I'll review the rotation file, sir," he said finally, a tacit agreement to consider the matter. "And I'll have a think about your training idea." That was all Kofi needed for now, a foothold. The following week, Kofi was summoned to a meeting with Lord Harrington, a senior courtier and Kofi's direct superior within the palace hierarchy. The room was opulent, all dark wood and portraits of long-dead monarchs. Lord Harrington, a man in his 60s with a patrician air, gestured for Kofi to sit. "Kofi, your memorandum has caused something of a stir," Harrington began, his tone carefully bland. "It's very thorough." "Thank you, sir. I believe the issue demands thoroughness." "Indeed." Harrington templed his fingers. "The concern, voiced in some quarters, is one of scope. We are the household cavalry. Our mandate is to protect the sovereign, not to police the moral compass of every constable in London." Kofi met his gaze evenly. "With respect, Lord Harrington, my proposal is precisely about protecting the sovereign. The man who stopped me, P.C. Davis, is one of hundreds of officers with authorized access to the palace perimeter during events. His judgment is compromised by prejudice. If he cannot correctly assess a man in civilian clothing, how can we trust his assessment of a potential threat in a crowd? He sees a narrative, not a person. That is a vulnerability. It is, in my professional opinion, a direct threat to the security of the post I am sworn to protect." He had reframed the entire argument. It was no longer about social justice. It was about national security. It was a language Lord Harrington understood perfectly. Harrington was quiet, his eyes studying Kofi. He saw not an angry black man, but a strategic and formidable officer who had identified a genuine weakness in the palace's defensive shield. "A vulnerability," Harrington repeated slowly. "You propose to run this training yourself?" "Initially for the palace-specific units. I would develop the curriculum. It must come from within the structure, sir. It must carry the weight of this office." He touched the scarlet of his tunic. "Otherwise, it will be dismissed as political correctness." Harrington gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Very well, Captain. You have a pilot program. 6 months. You will report your findings directly to me, but tread carefully, Mensa. You are challenging very old, very deep-rooted sensibilities." "As was the first guardsman of color, sir," Kofi replied softly. "I am merely following in his footsteps." The first training session was held in a cold lecture hall at Wellington Barracks. The attendees, a mix of Metropolitan Police and Ministry of Defense guards, sat with arms crossed, a wall of silent resentment. Kofi stood before them, not in his magnificent state dress, but in his daily service uniform. It was still scarlet, still authoritative, but less theatrical, more professional. He did not begin with theory, he began with a scenario. "Officer A," Kofi said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "You are on patrol near the mall. You see an individual, 6'4", of muscular build, dressed in dark nondescript clothing, repeatedly pacing near a security checkpoint while speaking agitatedly into a mobile phone. Your assessment? A few hands went up. The answers were uniform. Suspicious, potential threat, engage and question. Kofi nodded. Now, change one variable. The individual is me, Captain Mensah, in civilian attire, on my phone with my adjutant about a logistical error in tonight's guard mount. Your assessment now? The room fell utterly silent. The trap had been sprung. The same physicality, the same behavior, now framed by identity, elicited a completely different unspoken response. You see? Kofi said, his gaze sweeping across the room. The flaw is not in your eyesight, it is in the narrative your mind constructs before you even complete your observation. Your bias isn't just about race, it's about assumption. And in our line of work, assumption is the mother of catastrophic failure. He saw it then, in the eyes of a few of the officers, a flicker of understanding, a crack in the wall. For others, the resentment only hardened, but he had planted a seed. Weeks turned into months. Kofi became a familiar, and to some, a fearsome figure in the training circuits. He was unyielding, using his own experience, his own authority, to force a conversation no one else could. He learned that PC Davis had a history of complaints, all resolved informally. Kofi ensured his pilot program's final report recommended a formal review of such informal resolutions, tying them directly to security clearance protocols. The fight was exhausting, a constant battle on two fronts, against the overt prejudice outside and the insidious resistance within. But he was not alone. He found allies in younger officers, in a few progressive courtiers, and unexpectedly, in Sergeant Major Fletcher, who one day admitted over a whiskey, "You're making the regiment stronger, Captain. It's a damned unpleasant process, but you're making it stronger." One evening as Kofi was preparing to leave, his phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. "Captain Mensah?" a hesitant voice asked. "Speaking. It's PC Davis, sir." The voice was strained, thick with emotion. I've been put on administrative leave, pending a review. They cited your program?" Kofi said nothing, letting the silence press down on the man on the other end of the line. I wanted to say," Davis struggled for words. "I looked you up. I saw your picture. The uniform. What you are." He took a shuddering breath. "I couldn't see it. That day, I just couldn't see it." Kofi looked out his window at the courtyard below, where tourists mingled and guards stood immobile. The machine of tradition turned, slowly, inexorably. "Seeing," Kofi said finally, his voice quiet but firm, "is a skill, Officer Davies, one that requires constant practice. I suggest you use this time to practice it." He ended the call. The victory felt hollow and profound all at once. He had not changed the world. He had not even changed one man's heart, not truly. But he had enforced a consequence. He had made the system for a moment acknowledge its own rot. And for now, in the long, slow march of history, that was a battle won. He picked up his bearskin cap, ready to take his place once more upon the box, a symbol of an old order, fighting to birth a new one. The administrative leave for PC Davis was not the end of the matter, as Kofi had suspected it wouldn't be. It was merely the opening move in a much larger, more complex game. The backlash began quietly, a subterranean rumble within the old boy network that still held significant sway in certain corridors of power. A week after the phone call, Lord Harrington summoned Kofi once more. The atmosphere in the opulent office was cooler this time. A copy of a tabloid newspaper lay on the desk between them, folded to show a column with the headline, "PC Correctness Gone Mad. War Hero Cop sidelined for doing his job." "Unpleasant," Harrington said, tapping the paper. "The narrative is shifting, Kofi. They're painting Davis as a diligent public servant being persecuted by an overzealous, politically motivated establishment. You are, by extension, becoming a symbol of that establishment." Kofi scanned the article. It detailed Davis's military service in Afghanistan, glossing over the disciplinary complaints and framing the traffic stop as a routine check on a suspicious vehicle in a high-crime area. His own identity was carefully omitted, referred to only as a senior official. "They are framing the debate around sentiment, not security," Kofi observed. His voice calm, though a cold anger simmered in his gut. "My proposal was about operational integrity. This," he gestured at the paper, "is a deliberate distraction." "It's a very effective one," Harrington countered. "There are questions being asked in Parliament. The Commissioner of the Met is feeling the heat. The pilot program is being scrutinized under a political lens, not a practical one." "Then let us provide a practical demonstration," Kofi said, a new idea crystallizing. "The Royal Tattoo is in 6 weeks, a full-scale multi-agency security drill. Let us design a scenario that explicitly tests for perceptual bias in threat assessment. Let the results speak for themselves." Harrington's eyebrows rose. It was a bold, almost reckless proposal, a live-fire exercise, in a sense, for the minds of his personnel. "You're proposing we deliberately try to make our own security fail?" "I'm proposing we find the cracks before the enemy does," Kofi replied, "and we document it all." The planning for the drill, codenamed Operation Steadfast Guardian, became Kofi's sole focus. He worked with a small trusted team, including a reluctantly impressed Sergeant Major Fletcher. The scenario was intricate. Among the dozens of role players, families, tourists, protesters, they inserted their own agents. A young, white, well-dressed actor would be the actual bomb carrier, behaving nervously, his jacket wired with inert explosives. Meanwhile, they would have a second actor, a large black man in a tracksuit, simply sitting calmly on a bench, reading a paper. The test was to see which individual drew more initial proactive attention from the security forces. The day of the tattoo drill dawned bright and clear. The air crackled with a controlled tension. Kofi stood in the security command center, a bank of monitors showing feeds from dozens of cameras. His heart was a steady, heavy drum in his chest. This was a gamble. If it failed, if his theory was wrong, his career and his reform efforts would be finished. For the first hour, it was routine. The security teams were professional, thorough. Then, the actors entered their zones. On monitor 7, the white actor, Simon, fidgeted near a waste bin, repeatedly patting his jacket, his eyes darting. On monitor 12, the black actor, David, sat impassively, occasionally checking his watch. The radio chatter was telling. Team Alpha, keep an eye on male, blue jacket, north entrance. Looks agitated. Confirmed Alpha. He's been patting his chest. Could be a rig. The focus was overwhelmingly on Simon. David on the bench was virtually invisible to the security net. Kofi watched, his jaw tight. It was happening exactly as he predicted. The narrative of threat was being written based on preconceived notions, not on the actual glaringly suspicious behavior. Then, the script took an unplanned turn. A real fight broke out near the gates. A scuffle between two drunken tourists that had nothing to do with the drill. Security teams swarmed the area, their attention completely diverted. In the command center, alarms blared. The simulated device on Simon was now armed. The clock was ticking. And in the chaos, everyone had forgotten about David on the bench. Everyone except for one person, a young female PCO. Fresh from Kofi's training, her voice crackled over the radio, hesitant but clear. Control, this is PCO Evans at grid reference 12 Bravo. I have a male, seated dark tracksuit. He's been static for 40 minutes. It feels off. He doesn't fit the environment. Request a quiet visual check. Kofi leaned forward, his knuckles white on the console. That was it. That was the shift. She wasn't looking for frantic behavior. She was looking for a break in the pattern. She was seeing the narrative, not the stereotype. A plainclothes officer was dispatched. As he casually approached David's bench, the drill controller, following the scenario, sent a command. David stood up and began walking briskly towards a restricted access point, the detonator now visible in his hand. The command center erupted. They had been focusing on the obvious, noisy threat, and had nearly missed the silent patient one. PCO Evans' call had been the only thing that prevented a total simulated catastrophe. When the drill was concluded and the teams were debriefed, the data was undeniable. The post-operation report, which Kofi authored with brutal clarity, was a damning indictment of the status quo. It proved, with cold hard evidence, that perceptual bias wasn't a social issue. It was a critical vulnerability in the security apparatus. The tabloid narrative collapsed overnight. The conversation in Parliament shifted from political correctness to national security readiness. Lord Harrington, now armed with irrefutable proof, became a staunch advocate, and Kofi's pilot program was not just renewed, it was expanded and made permanent. Weeks later, Kofi was invited to give the keynote address at the annual Security and Policing Conference. He stood at the podium, looking out at a sea of uniforms. From every branch of the service, he saw skepticism, curiosity, and in some eyes, a new respect. He didn't speak of his own experience, he spoke of the drill, he spoke of data and vulnerabilities, he spoke of the young PTO who saw what others missed because she was trained to see differently. Security is not just about walls and weapons, he concluded, his voice resonating through the hall. It is about perception. It is about the ability to see the world as it is, not as we assume it to be. The highest duty of any officer is not just to enforce the law, but to uphold the truth. And the truth is, a threat can wear any face. Our failure to see that is the greatest threat of all. As he stepped away from the podium to thunderous, if somewhat stunned, applause, he caught the eye of Sergeant Major Fletcher, who was standing at the back of the room. The old soldier didn't smile, but he gave a single, slow, deliberate nod. It was not a celebration, it was an acknowledgement. The battle was far from over, but Captain Kofi Mensah had just won the war for the legitimacy of his cause. He had forced the machine to look at itself in the mirror, and in doing so, had begun to change its very nature. The victory at the conference was a strategic one, but the true, grinding work of institutional change began in the weeks that followed. Kofi's expanded mandate meant his days were now a relentless cycle of meetings, curriculum development, and liaising with stubborn, entrenched department heads. The resistance had become more sophisticated, less about open defiance and more about bureaucratic inertia. The slow no, as Sergeant Major Fletcher had grimly dubbed it. It was during this period of administrative trench warfare that a different kind of summons arrived. Not from Lord Harrington, but from the office of the Keeper of the Privy Purse. The request was formal, cryptic, and concerned a matter of heritage and representation. Intrigued and wary, Kofi presented himself at the appointed time in an anteroom of the Royal Collections. He was met by a Dr. Althea Finch, a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense manner. "Captain Mensah, thank you for coming," she said, leading him into a climate-controlled archive. "We are undertaking a new long-term project. A comprehensive audit of the Crown's historical narrative is told through its art and artifacts. We aim to present a fuller, more honest story." She stopped before a large portrait, shrouded in a protective cloth. This includes re-examining the stories we have chosen to tell about ourselves for centuries. With a gentle pull, she removed the cloth. Kofi's breath caught in his throat. The painting was magnificent, rendered in the grand heroic style of the 18th century. It depicted a battle scene from the Napoleonic Wars, the air thick with smoke and glory. In the foreground, a young, resplendent officer in the scarlet coat of the Foot Guards held the regimental colors aloft, his face a mask of determined valor, and standing directly beside him, his own musket leveled at the enemy, was a black soldier. His uniform was identical, his bearing just as proud, his face etched with the same fierce resolve. He wasn't a servant or a caricature in the background. He was a brother in arms, central to the composition. "This is the defense of Hougoumont," Dr. Finch said softly. Painted in 1816, the artist, a veteran of the battle, included several black soldiers he fought alongside. Their presence was documented in muster rolls and diaries. Yet, for 200 years, this painting has been in storage. The official, reproduced versions of this moment edited him out. Kofi stood in silence, his eyes fixed on the forgotten guardsman. He felt a connection that transcended time, a direct line from that man's struggle to his own. He wasn't the first, he was simply the most recent in a long, unacknowledged line. "The narrative," Kofi finally said, his voice thick with emotion, "has always been curated." "Precisely," Dr. Finch replied, "and it is time to recurate. We want this painting, and others like it, to be centrally displayed, but we need the right context. We need a voice that understands both the military tradition and the weight of this rediscovery." She looked at him. "We would like you to consult on the exhibition, to help us write the placards, to shape the story." This was a battle on a new front, the front of memory and legacy. While he was fighting to change the present-day culture, he could also help reclaim the past. It was a profound responsibility. "I would be honored," Kofi said. The work was painstaking. Even in this scholarly realm, he encountered friction. A senior curator argued that emphasizing the black soldiers was imposing a modern political lens on history. Kofi's response was firm. "Erasing them was the political act," he countered. "Including them is simply historical accuracy. It is restoring the truth." He spent evenings in the archives, cross-referencing the painter's notes with old regimental records. He learned the forgotten guardsman's name was Samuel Okoro, a freeman from London who had enlisted and served with distinction. Kofi insisted the placard bear his name, his story. He was not to be an anonymous symbol, but a man, restored to history. Months later, the exhibition, titled "For Crown and Country: Untold Stories from the Front Line," opened to the public. The centerpiece was the restored defense of Hougoumont, now lit with the reverence it deserved. Kofi, in full dress uniform, stood to the side as Lord Harrington and Dr. Finch gave the opening speeches. After the ribbon was cut, he watched the visitors stream in. He saw school children, their eyes wide, pointing at Samuel Okoro. He saw an elderly black couple, standing before the painting for a long time, their postures straight with a quiet, defiant pride. He saw young officers from his own regiment, studying the painting not as a piece of art, but as a part of their lineage they never knew they had. Sergeant Major Fletcher approached him, his gaze also on the painting. "Never knew," he grunted, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "Served for 40 years and never knew we were there from the beginning." He turned to Kofi. "Changes the shape of things, doesn't it, sir? Knowing your history didn't start with you." "It does, Sergeant Major," Kofi agreed. "It gives the ground beneath your feet a different solidity." As the evening wound down, a young journalist approached him. "Captain Mensah, a remarkable exhibition. Your work on the security reforms is well known, but this is different. What connects the two for you?" Kofi looked from the journalist's eager face back to the resolute eyes of Samuel Okoro in the painting. "They are the same fight," Kofi said, his voice calm and sure. "The fight for the truth. Out there," he gestured beyond the palace walls, "the truth is about who can be a threat. In here, the truth is about who can be a hero. For too long, both narratives have been controlled by the same narrow set of assumptions. My work, all of it, is about expanding the story. Because when you expand the story, you expand the possibilities for everyone. You make the institution not weaker through change, but stronger through integrity." The journalist scribbled furiously. Kofi knew his words would be in a paper tomorrow, adding another layer to the evolving story. The journey wasn't over. PC Davis was still fighting his dismissal through the police, Federation. There were still senior officers who resented his influence, but as he stood in that gallery, flanked by the rediscovered heroes of the past and shaping the guardians of the future, Captain Kofi Mensah knew, with unshakable certainty, that the narrative was his to write now. The success of the exhibition solidified Kofi's influence in a way no security report ever could. He was no longer just a reformer, he was becoming a custodian of a broader, more honest legacy. The quiet grumblings of the old guard grew quieter, not out of full acceptance, but from the realization that the tide of history was visibly turning, and Captain Mensah was its pilot. His work settled into a new, potent rhythm. Mornings were spent refining the now mandatory bias training, incorporating the powerful lesson of the steadfast guardian drill. Afternoons were often dedicated to the royal collections, where he advised on acquiring new pieces and reframing old ones, ensuring the forgotten threads of history were woven back into the grand tapestry. He had become a bridge, connecting the palace's storied past to its necessary future. One crisp autumn day, he was inspecting the new guard at the Friary Court when his phone vibrated with a message from Lord Harrington. It was brief. "The garden party shortlist has been approved. Your recommendation for Piazio Evans has been accepted. The palace expects you to attend as well, of course." A rare, genuine smile touched Kofi's lips. The garden party was one of the summer's most sought sought-after social events, a symbol of recognition and inclusion. Recommending PTO Evans for an invitation was a deliberate act, a way to cement her courage into the institution's culture. Her presence there would send a clearer message than any memo. The day of the party was brilliant. The palace lawns a vibrant canvas of elegant hats and morning suits. Kofi, in his full-dress uniform, stood out like a scarlet standard. He watched as PCO Evans arrived, looking slightly overwhelmed in a new dress, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. He made his way to her. "PCO Evans," he said warmly, "it's good to see you." "Captain Mensah," she stammered, a blush creeping up her cheeks. "Thank you again, sir, for the recommendation. I still don't feel like I did anything special." "You saw clearly," he corrected gently. "That is the most special and the most necessary skill of all. Enjoy your day. You've earned it." As he moved through the crowd, he received respectful nods from senior military figures and curious glances from dignitaries. He was a known quantity now, his story interwoven with the palace's own narrative of modernization. Then he saw them. Across the lawn, standing near a pristine flower bed, was P.C. Davis. He was out of uniform, wearing an ill-fitting suit, and looked profoundly uncomfortable. He was with his wife, a nervous-looking woman who clung to his arm. Their presence was a shock. It was a level of reconciliation Kofi had not anticipated. Their eyes met across the green expanse. Davis flinched, then seemed to steel himself. He whispered something to his wife and began to walk, alone, towards Kofi. The crowd seemed to part unconsciously, sensing the gravity of the moment. He stopped a few feet from Kofi, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed somewhere near Kofi's medals. "Captain Mensah," he said, his voice low and rough. "Mr. Davis," Kofi replied, using the civilian title, a small but significant acknowledgement of his changed status. Davis swallowed hard. I lost my appeal. The dismissal stands." He finally looked up and Kofi saw not anger, but a hollowed out exhaustion. "My wife, she made me come. She said I needed to see it. All of it." He gestured weakly at the grandeur around them, at Kofi in his uniform. "To understand what I couldn't see." He took a shaky breath. "I was wrong, not just about the procedure. I was wrong about everything. About you. About what this," he gestured again, this time encompassing the very idea of the institution, "is supposed to be." The apology was raw, unfinished, and all the more real for it. It wasn't about saving his job, that was gone. It was about salvaging something of his own understanding of the world. Kofi regarded him for a long moment. The anger was gone, replaced by a sort of profound pity. The man had been broken on the wheel of a system he once blindly served. "Seeing the truth is often painful, Mr. Davis," Kofi said, his tone not forgiving, but factual. "But it is the only way to grow. I hope you find a new path." Davis just nodded, a jerky, defeated motion, before turning and walking back to his wife. His shoulders slumped. Kofi watched him go. There was no triumph in this, only the quiet closing of a chapter. He turned his gaze back to the sun-dappled lawn, to the mix of faces old and new, to PTO Evans now chatting with a group of younger officers. The institution was imperfect, often unjust, but it was not monolithic. It could be moved. It could be healed. He stood there, a solitary figure in scarlet and gold, rooted in a history he had helped reclaim, guarding a future he was actively shaping. The work would never truly be finished, but for the first time Captain Kofi Mensah felt a sense of peace, knowing that he had secured a beachhead for integrity, and that the battle, from here on out, would be carried forward by others he had inspired. The story would continue.